When I think about healing, I cannot help but think about scars. They are a sign of healing. And this morning I shared a little bit about just two of the many scars that I've acquired in my life and how they've healed. People can have a lot of different feelings about scars. Some people think that they are ugly. Some people think they are beautiful. Scars are an indication of a journey taken, an experience. Irrespective of how you feel about them aesthetically, scars mean something. They are not just healed over bits of flesh. They are healed over bits of flesh where something has happened. We could end up with a scar from surgery, a scar from an accident, a scar from disease, a scar from teasing a cat or being careless in the kitchen. When he was young, he's a man of 23 now, my son was a bundle of energy. He hurt himself so many times that I thought the hospital would report me to Child Protective Services. One time, he got a really bad scrape on his knee, the kind of thing that would make your stomach churn. He, of course, being a stereotypical little boy, thought it was very cool. And of course, he didn't worry about it too much and kept re-injuring it during the course of his incredibly enthusiastic play. He didn't even try to keep the Band-Aid on. It kept coming off, and I cannot say enough how horrible it really was. It seemed like forever before a scab formed, much less a scar. And he had re-injured it so many times that for a long time, after the raw flesh on his knee turned into the scab that turned into a scar, it seemed so delicate and ready to open again. There is a science to the knitting together of flesh. When we have a physical injury, the body creates collagen fibers to mend the flesh. When the injury has completely healed, in that space where the injury was, there is where you will find the scar. It's skin that looks different, and sometimes it feels different too. But scars can form anywhere that something has happened. It doesn't have to be something physical. Physical injuries result directly from physical trauma, but a traumatic event is any event that causes physical, emotional, spiritual, or psychological harm. Injuries to our minds, our spirit, these can be caused by physical trauma, but also by non-physical trauma. There are many different types of traumatic events that do not involve physical injury, death, or disease. There are many things we do not think of as traumatic, but they are, because of the effect that they have on us. Traumatic events, whether they are major ones like being involved in a natural disaster or combat, or small ones like conflict with a family member or spouse, tend to erode our sense of control in ways noticeable and unnoticeable to us. And this impacts on how we engage with the world or not. With the less immediately life-altering and smaller traumatic events, one coping mechanism, although not necessarily a long-term or successful one, is to try to rationalize it and to minimize the legitimacy of our emotional response to it. While both large and small traumatic events have an ability to create a feeling of powerlessness or helplessness in the person experiencing them, those feelings are greatly exacerbated in larger events. And they adversely impact on the way that we live our lives on a daily basis. And when we heal from them, if we heal from them, we have a scar, in a manner of speaking. This may or may not be a bad thing. It just means that we are different because of it. What are some of the events that are not necessarily physical that one might consider traumatic? Sometimes they're small slights, sometimes they are major transgressions. They could happen in many of the areas of our lives, at home, the places we work, the places we play, maybe in the places where we worship, and in society at large. Divorce, the loss of a job, moving, the realization that those in whom we put our trust do not necessarily value the pursuit of truth, and that it has become a fungible good. There are more ways to distinguish traumatic events in addition to thinking about them being physical or non-physical. We experience them in different ways. There is acute trauma, which results from exposure to a single incident. And this means not only experiencing it, but also witnessing it firsthand. Repetitive trauma occurs when there are multiple chronic or prolonged, overwhelming traumatic events. Arguing all the time, a lengthy illness requiring multiple treatments, my son's knee. Complex trauma occurs when repetitive trauma takes place within a certain context. For example, a relationship. Developmental trauma is what most often happens to children who suffer from abuse or neglect. Vicarious or secondhand trauma, which comes from hearing about the trauma experienced by others. There's historical trauma, which is the cumulative injury to a people over time. Examples of this could be genocide, colonialism, war, slavery. Intergenerational trauma occurs when living with people who have experienced trauma. Many of these different types of trauma have played a role in all of our lives and in the wider world. We see it all the time in our neighborhoods and in the news. And while there is no one sure way to successfully accomplish the healing of non-physical trauma in the individual, except perhaps through therapy, it is unequivocal that, like my son's knee, the healing cannot start until the wounding stops. What about the trauma that causes wounding to our world? One thing that comes to mind is the environmental damage that we inflict on the earth. But there are other things that happen that negatively affect the world and the people in it, creating feelings of helplessness. We are coming to the end of Black History Month. But what we call Black history is really the history of all of us, whether we want to admit it or not. Part of that history was marked at the beginning of this month. February 1st was the 60th anniversary of the beginning of the Greensboro sit-ins. For those of you who do not know, 4 young men, Joseph McNeil, Franklin McCain, Jabril Kazan, and David Richmond, students at North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State College, began a sit-in at the Woolworths in downtown Greensboro. Their sit-in was a protest whose goal was to stop the wounding caused by racism, which manifested itself in the segregated lunch counter there. And here we are, 60 years later. It seems we cannot stop reopening that wound. One could argue that this is an example of trauma that is directly experienced, vicariously experienced, repetitive, complex, historical, and intergenerational. How much hurt and pain does this represent? But this is only one thing that causes injury to the world and those in it. Whether or not it is happening to us or around us, we are assaulted by the knowledge that there are those who are homeless, those without adequate medical care, those who are hungry, families that have been torn apart, those who are denied full access to facilities, those who are victims of gun violence, misogyny, and religious intolerance. And while time may have healed my arm and my hand, time did not work here because the wounding continues. But what causes it? Is it based on some underlying disdain for one another? Or could it be that we are in a state of separateness? These are not just the events and situations that cause injury, they also are the injury. And the one thing that causes all of these injuries is separateness. The failure to see and embrace our connection to others. The inability to see ourselves in others. The lack of empathy. So many of us are working hard to fix the world. We're slapping on Band-Aids to what collectively ails us with programs aimed at fixing the symptoms, thinking they will fix the wounds we have endured without taking the time to assess the thing that caused the injury in the first place. And we are wounded over and over again, unable to heal. So what do we need to heal? First, we need to stop the wounding. What role does faith and religious community play? Or more precisely, is there anything about Unitarian Universalism that can give us direction insofar as what we can do, at least? As Unitarian Universalists, we often look to our principles not so much for spiritual guidance, but for guidance in how we are to be in relationship with each other and with the world. Our second principle asks us to, in our dealings with others, use justice, equity, and compassion. Compassion. The healing and transformative power of compassion is increasingly recognized. So, yes, showing compassion to ourselves and others, being kind to ourselves and others can be restorative. And if we deconstruct the rest of that principle, we could say that true compassion could lead to a sincere application of justice and equity. And maybe that would stop the wounding and eventually lead the way to make us whole and healthy perhaps for the first time ever. And how are we able to tap into our compassionate selves? I have already spoken of our unmet need to recognize connection. The connections we share are honored in our seventh principle, which lifts up the interdependent web of existence. It calls us away from whatever inclination we may have to get lost in our separateness, which makes us unable to really be compassionate. Is it that simple? Maybe. But can we really claim a commitment to justice and equity, to stopping the hurt and injury, and to begin the healing unless we have a true understanding of the nature of the injury? And we can only do that by being in relationship and engaging in sincere and open communication with those who have been hurt and who are hurting. And that mainly consists of listening to one another. That means we have to care about others, to take the time, not to treat them in a way that we think is just and equitable, but to listen deeply and without judgment so that we can know what that might mean to them. If we have true compassion for one another, if we truly care for one another and show that we do in a way that means something, we can help to heal each other and the world. Helga Luest, an expert in the field of trauma, says, "The key to healing and building resilience is connection with others who can validate, empathize, and understand our feelings and experiences." Our disconnection from each other has caused much harm and injury. Separateness is a devastating weapon which has caused all kinds of wounding to so many people, mental, emotional, and physical. And even those who cause harm to others, in an absolute sense, cause harm to themselves as well by being out of relationship and by not acknowledging and benefiting from the connection to that which is larger than themselves. May we live into our most compassionate selves as we set about the work necessary in order to begin healing the world and each other, knowing that we all need healing and that we all have the power to heal.